Hi, welcome to day 8 on Learn Code and Create. This is our second week in this program, and in the past week we spent a lot of time studying HTML and so. And in the beginning of that week we learned about the web and its various technologies, which included HTML, HTTP, and the browser. So throughout that week we spent a lot of time studying HTML because we learned that HTML is the building block of any web document. So we spent a lot of time learning that. So at the end of the week, we all started encountering some issues when it comes to designing whatever we are building. So some of us wanted to have their documents laid out in a particular fashion. Some of us some of us wanted to have some colors. Some of us wanted to center some content here and there, and it all couldn't be done with HTML. And I remember telling one of you that this is actually you getting to the end of the HTML. So it is time now we call for help, and the tool we need to go to help us in that matter is the CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So CSS is a special language that is built to help us design or to help us fashion, to help us manipulate HTML elements, especially to give them aesthetic views. So that's why our main focus throughout this week now is to study this CSS. How can we use this CSS to add beauty to our web documents? Like this page you are seeing, all this beauty you are seeing is simply CSS applied to HTML. The proof is if I do view source code, you see the source code as HTML as basic as it is, just like the way you have been typing the source code with HTML. But where does the design come from? So basically that's CSS, and that's going to be our topic today. So now you might ask yourself, okay, what does the CSS look like and how do we do it? Where do we get it? So before we dive into understanding what CSS is like, we need to understand what is actually going on when the browser decides to display the page. Remember, we said that part of the technologies of the web, the browser is part, and we said the browser is the tool used to display HTML documents. So this is basically, it's like you having a Word document. So when you have a document which is .doc, you know that you need to use Microsoft Word to open it, or docx if you want. So the same thing we said, when you are having a document that is .html, in that same case, you need a browser to view it. So now we know whenever we are working or we are building HTML documents, we write tags like this. How does the browser actually change these tags into something visual? That's the great question we want to understand in this first place, this first part. How does the browser do that? So I've built a sample page here. So I went on in our Lance codes folder, and I created a folder called day 8. So you should probably try that. And inside day 8, I created another file which I named index.html, simply like that, right? So I have the content of this index.html opened with my text editor, which is here. So it is a basic page which contains a title. Then I have a header section area here, and then I have a main section here. And so, and in here I just have a heading 1, a nav, and then I put in the list. And then here in the main I have a heading 1 and then some few paragraphs, and then an article tag here. So it's just some basic thing. So when this page is previewed, so let me open all and open it with the browser. So I'll double click and then it opens. So this is what we get as a result. So the question is, let me reduce so that we can see them side by side. Do this and this. So the question is that how does the browser, right, is able to translate this H1 here we see into this here, right? How does the browser do that? It is very important for us to understand it because CSS is about manipulating the display of HTML tags So if that's the case, we need to understand how the HTML tags behave, or how they are actually seen by the browser. How does the browser actually handle them? That's how we will be able to tell the browser, oh, through CSS, okay, change this one into blue, change this one into red, underline this and that. So that's the question. So here we can see from plain text as this, the browser transforms it into something visually nice, and then from just a list like this we get something like this, and then here too. So from this heading one, so one thing you might notice in this pattern on how the browser renders is that that's what we call renders. The browser renders the HTML. So one thing you might notice so far is that the browser tries to render the content of the HTML document from the top to the bottom, right? So if we are to perceive it, it will be like, it will start from the top and then start going down, down, and anytime it meets a tag, it will also render it respectively, and so on. It continues like this one by one. But apart from that, as this direction too, the browser does render at any given point. So let's assume the browser is rendering this line 13. So it will start rendering from the left to the right. So line 13, that's how. So this is the equivalent here. So it will start from here and go in this direction and render. So it renders top, bottom, left to right. It is very important to have that concept. You will understand it when we start looking at where to put the CSS, right? So that being said, the next thing we also need to notice here so far is that there are some tags like this heading one here. Once I use them, you see that nothing else followed. The list here should have been maybe after the sheet, but it didn't happen. And also whenever we use the LIs, you can see that every single LI goes to the next line. But unlike these headings and what the ULs, if you look at the strong tag here, if I use this strong tag which is here, and then any other tag, let's assume I even make this this one here strong again. So if I make this one strong again and go and reload, you can see although the two strong tags are actually following each other, they are not broken into the next line. So what happens here is that the browser has what we call the display modes, right? So it displays things, some of the things into what we call blocks. So if I'm going to draw again, so like this element right now, which is the heading one, it displays it into a block like this. So whenever it sees these kind of tags, and that's these tags, we call them the block tags. Their display is block. So anytime the browser will kind of draw some virtual rectangle like this, we don't see it now, but there's a way for you to see it. And then for this one too, because it's a block tag, it will automatically book this whole block for this tag, and then do the same thing for all the other block tags like this. But for the other tags like the heading, the block, I mean, like for other tags like the bold here, we've seen what the browser will do. The same thing with the italic. The browser will simply keep a small rectangle around them, a small rectangle, and then bring another rectangle next to it, and so on. So some of these tags behave like this. They allow them, the rectangle is not big, it doesn't cover the whole space from left to right, but it is just around the content itself. You see, so somebody asked me, why can't they align the tables together, have one table next to each other, like have them like this. I've mentioned that earlier this yesterday in the live. So it, because the tables are actually block element, so you learn to know them one by one. But in general, all the headings, H1 to H6, they are all blocks. All the ULs and LIs, all the list elements in general are blocks. The paragraphs are block. The divs are blocks. The sections and so are blocks as well. So you kind of end up knowing them, but the text formatting elements such as EMI, strong, bold, A for the anchor or the links are all inline elements. So this is what I can say about that. So we have inline elements and we have block elements. These two display modes actually influence how our browser renders our HTML code. So that's a very important aspect we need to look at. So now you might be asking, what is the CSS? What is CSS for? How do we use CSS? Like we said earlier, CSS is used to help us style our HTML documents. So basically, it helps us to style our HTML tags. So what should it look like? How do we do that? So let me give you an example. Let's assume this text here, which is CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet, which is located in our code here. How can I change its color? So I could go ahead and then use what we call a star attribute. There's an attribute called star that can be used with all the HTML elements. So you declare the attribute as we usually do with any other attribute. Then we bring in the equals to sign, and then in the equals to sign in the value code, here, we can now write something that could change the color of this thing. So it is basic as this color, and then let me say green. So by doing that and now going back to refresh the page, you can see that the text changes into green. So also we had an issue when we're validating our document, I think day 6. Yes. So the word consortium told us we should not use the border tag like this to set the border of a table. So I do tr and I do td. So and they also told us we should not use the width attribute here to set the table's width, let's say 200. We should rather use CSS to do that. So we could come in and then use the CSS attribute and then say border. What do we want the border to be? First of all, we'll set some few things. Don't worry for now. We'll come back on what this does and go ahead. So if we refresh, we can see the table inserted here with the cell. So here you can see how we get the table looks very cleaner. The border is a bit different from what you usually get when you use the attribute border itself. So that's one of the advantages of using CSS. So that being said, next is the question is, how do we get CSS together with HTML? How do we put them together? Since there are two different languages, how do we get them together? So there are many ways of handling how to put CSS together with HTML. The first way is what I was just doing right now, which is to use the attribute star, and whatever is in the value of the attribute should be CSS specific stuff. It should be CSS specific language. So here it is not HTML. What I'm writing here is CSS language. That's how we speak CSS. So the other example is the one I added with the heading one here. So it is CSS specific language, whatever is in these two codes. So the next thing for us is to learn this language. But before that, let's assume the only thing we know about this language is color, and then set a color name. It might be blue, green, or the English language colors. You can write any color here. So we'll assume that's the only thing we know about the CSS language. Through that, now we will learn various ways of placing CSS inside our document, right? So the first way is this way. Anytime you have a tag and you want to affect the tag with something, you just bring that CSS star attribute. So let's say this heading one, the color will be lavender. So if I go back to my browser to preview, I can see the color changed into lavender. So if I go to this one too, and then I will change the color into, so I'll bring the attribute star, then change the color into yellow, preview, and we can see. So this is very bad. Let me change it to orange. Good. So we can see, and in fact where I have lavender, let me use tomato. Good. So here we are. So this is one good way of doing that. By using the attribute style on any tag, you just can style it. So let me come to the strong tag here. I will add the style attribute, and then I will also say color is pink. That's the only language we know. That's the only thing we know about the CSS language, changing the color. So by just adding the color name, we change the color. So we go ahead with the next attribute, the next tag. We want to start this tag, or let's say the emphasis here. So we'll add the attribute star, and then we say color again, and let's say we say green, sea green, so something like this. We reload, you see that the color has been changed here. So that's one way of writing CSS, and this way of writing CSS is called inlining the CSS. So that's the first method, inlining the CSS. So inline CSS. So you've learned how to inline CSS using the attribute, the star attribute. So anywhere you have a tag and you want to specify a CSS star on that tag, you just call the attribute star. So we can add in bracket star attribute. So I'll make it at or attribute. Good. So we use the star attribute for that. So what other way can we bring CSS in? So the other way is, and so far you can even already notice the limitations with this way is, for example, if I want two tags to have the tomato color, I will have to copy the same thing 2 times, and if I have it 10 times, I have to copy the same thing 10 times. And so far too, you can notice that this is becoming cumbersome because we are mixing the CSS stuff with HTML stuff, and it's becoming very difficult maybe to distinguish. Over time, this can be really cumbersome. So there might be some other ways of sorting this problem. So the other way is to use what we call the embedded CSS using a tag called star. So this is the difference. Initially, we use an attribute called star, but this time around, we use a tag called star. Just like we bring the tag, let's say heading 5 tag, the same way we bring the tag called star, just like this, right? So you can specify all these other attributes, but the tag is basically star and star. So in between the tag, you write CSS specific stuff, and the only thing we know about CSS now is color colon something. So that's what we know about CSS. So that's one way. Another way of doing it, but it's not as simple as we could do, like with the attribute, just write this. No, we don't do that. We need to kind of tell it what should this go for, or what should this be applied to. So like we need to specify. So if we say, for example, it should go with the heading 1, then it will do that. But we also have to kind of protect it in a curly brackets like this to say that, okay, this style goes to heading 1. So by doing that, all our heading ones should have this color, except because our heading ones, if you check here, they are having inline CSS already, and inline CSS supersedes any other CSS, which means if you've written any CSS somewhere that is targeting this heading 1, and then you write the same CSS by inlining it to this tag, the inline version will overtake because it's like the authority. It is at home. It is directly on the tag, so it will always have power over any other style, right? So the best way for us to see if this works is to remove any other inline CSS we have on heading 1. So this is heading 1. So I will remove this one again. So by doing so, you should now be able to have the color applied to all the heading ones. So that's one of the advantages of this tag, the star tag. You can write one and then it will affect many, right? So we'll come back on this principle here, but that's the game. And by the way, this star tag, it is advised. You see, I just placed it somewhere in the middle of the document. It doesn't matter where, but it still worked. But it is advised that we get it in the head tag, which is here. So it's advised we place it here. And the reason being, remember, the document loads, the browser renders the document from top, bottom, left, right. So if it is from top, it is better for the browser to see the star before it meets the tag. Otherwise, if it goes and meets the tag without the styling, you might see the tag you might see the result of the tag, and the tag is not formatted, it's not starred yet. Then when the browser meets the star, it will come back again and then start styling, and you might face some flashing of non-formatted document HTML. So it's a problem that can happen, but in our case with these small stars, you might not notice because it's too fast. The browser does that too fast when it goes and comes back. So it is advised to bring this CSS, this star tag right inside the head of your document. So this is the second way of connecting HTML with your CSS. We said that was embed. So the embedded. So I hope that's this monstrous word. Embedded CSS. And this one we use the star tag. So be careful with that. The inline we use star attribute, but this one we use the star tag. So we've seen two ways of joining HTML with CSS. The other way, a third way, is to use what we call an external CSS. In both ways, if you continue to write a lot of CSS and a lot, you can see this one too can become very difficult to distinguish with the HTML code. It can become very cumbersome as well. So another option is to have this whole CSS stuff removed completely from the HTML side, and that's what we call a separation of concerns. So every single thing that relates to CSS should go into a file that contains only CSS. Anything related to HTML should stay in a file that deals with only HTML. So we'll remove all these elements related to CSS. Anything CSS, we'll get rid of it in this document and leave the document entirely and purely HTML. So now we'll create a new file in our folder again, and we'll name that one css.css, or if you want, we'll name it stars, our stars, and then the extension must be CSS. So that's what tells the browser that, oh, this is a file that contains CSS. You see the difference? We had a file called .html to tell the browser that this is a web document, it contains HTML. But this one, to tell the browser that it contains CSS, we use .css extension. So once that's done, you can open it and write some CSS inside. So let me open it with my favorite text editor again. So here our file is completely empty. So here you don't need to specify anything again apart from just writing the CSS specific language like we did earlier by saying color red, and we said we are applying that color red to the tag heading 1. So we do that, the same thing we write here. Now if we go and preview our document, we could see that nothing happens. So the reason being that so far there's no particular relationship, there's nothing telling this HTML document to use these CSS stars. So there's no linking, there's no connection between them. So that's why we bring in the linking, the connection. So that connection is made using the tag called link. So you do link like this. And what do you want to link? So you said href. Remember, we use this tag href, this attribute href, to create links or anchors. So it makes sense. We are creating a link between an HTML document and then a CSS file. So it makes sense that we get href here as well. So in the href, you specify that you are linking the stars.css to this HTML document in which you are. So we are linking this HTML document we are in to this stars.css, or the other way around. We are linking this stars.css file to this whole HTML document. So by doing that, we need to add another attribute, which is rel, which stands for relationship. What is the relationship between this file, this stars.css and the HTML document? So the relationship is a style sheet. So by default, that's how it goes. So there are some other attributes we can use under this link, but I just want you to focus on these two attributes. They are very important and they are mandatory. The rest are optional. So by doing that, and we refresh now, we should see that the styles we wrote in that CSS file, that stars.css file, are now being applied to our document. So this is what we call external CSS. The CSS is outside the HTML document. It says external to the HTML document. So this is how we get it working. So this is our third way of writing or joining CSS with HTML, external CSS. External. So to have external CSS, we use the link tag. So in bracket, link tag. So that's how we get the external CSS. Now, I have to be fair with you, and there are other ways of actually connecting HTML and CSS, right? We have the import, and we have made the web server configuration or headers configuration and so on. We won't go there because mostly these three options are enough. They are quite enough. And if you take even giant websites like Facebook and so on, that's all they do. There's nothing really bad about that. Don't always try to look for uh, the deepest way of doing things. I think as simple as it might look, that's all you need to link any HTML document with the CSS. And now you might be wondering, which way should we go? Which one should we choose? And the truth is, you usually work with these three ways in general. So sometimes, or mostly, when your website is big enough, it is best that you externalize the CSS so that you really get that separation of concerns I mentioned. And then sometimes you might want the CSS to load so fast at the same time with the web page. Then you embed the CSS or part of your CSS that you want to load faster. So you bring that part in the embedded area, and then the remaining parts that don't matter much can stay in the external CSS. Sometimes you need to kind of specifically modify one tag. No matter what goes on that particular tag, you insist that you want it to have this particular behavior or this particular look and feel. So you go in, you do some inline CSS on that particular tag. So it's a combination of the three, and depending on what you target, performance, or you are just hacking on the go, any of these options will always be useful. So do not prioritize one over others. They are all useful. You should learn how to use them very well. Now we have cleared everything around CSS and how we can get them to work with our HTML document. It is important that we start to learn what actually CSS is, because that's what we are going to spend this whole week to doing. We'll be spending this week doing. So what is it? Right now, I wrote this crazy stuff here. What are they? What is it like? How do we actually know the CSS language? We learned with HTML that we actually combine tags and so on. What about CSS? So CSS works with what we call rules, right? CSS contains what we call rules. This is an example of a rule. And a rule, let's go to our drawing board. So the rules, right? So a rule in CSS is like any rule, like uh, do not make calls while driving. So it's a rule, right? Do not drink while driving. It is a rule. So the same thing goes with CSS. Let's say do not be bigger than 10 pixels. It's a rule. Change your color into green. It is a rule. So that's how CSS works. So we set a rule, and the rule is divided into two main parts. In our case, we have the heading 1. So let's bring that tag here. Let me write it well. Heading 1. And then after the heading 1, we have this curly bracket. And then when something comes and it says color, and also, by the way, for people who speak British like myself, of course, uh, it is not color, it's not color like this, it's not color, it is color. It's American, so it is color. Please avoid using you here. So going back to it, and we said the color we said was red. And here you don't have to use capital letters, it's just small letters, red. And then I close the curly bracket. So this is an example of rule. Let's say the shortest rule probably. And the rule is divided into two main areas. Let me change the color into something green. So the first area is this area, and the second area is this area. This first area here is what we call the selector. Selector. So the selector is actually the target of the rule. Who is going to suffer from the rule? Who is going to receive the rule? Who is going to obey the rule? That's what we do. We pick him up, and then now we define the rule. So after the selector, we have what we call declarations area. So this is the declaration area. So we declare the rule here, declaration. So we have selected a target, then we declare the rule. We declare the rule for the target or on the target. But when we look at the declaration, we can also see that it is subdivided into two main areas here and this, and they are all separated with this. So this is a separator between what we call now the property. So this is a property. The declaration is composed of a property, you memorize all this with time, and then the value. And this might ring a bell because remember when you were declaring your HTML tags, let's say heading 1, and then you give it an attribute, let's say like what attribute can we say? Let me just create something randomly. Let's assume we add the attribute weight, which is not actually working. It's something we are just saying. You see that we have the attribute name, and then we have equals to, and then in quotes we put whatever weight we want. We saw that with tables. So you enter the weight and you are good to go. So this same thing happens here. You can see the attribute name, then the equals to sign. In our case, the equals to sign correspond to this separator, which is column, and then the value here, which goes to this value here. So the same thing happens. So in CSS, let me revert this for cleanliness. In CSS, we have in the declaration the property and the value, the property and value. So with this being said, let's go back to our HTML code and the CSS tool. Since our CSS is external CSS, and by the way, you are free to kind of break the lines into whatever you want. So let me go ahead and then I will add something else. Let's say we say P. So we target P. So that's our selector. We selected the P. Then I'll bring the curly bracket and we'll go to the declaration. What do we want to declare on the P? So we want to change the color and then we'll make it gray. So that's what we want to do to the P. And we said since you are using external CSS, or in the case of embedded CSS, when you select one thing like this, it will be applied to all these elements in the document. So all the P's will suffer from this same attack. So you can see the paragraphs here have been changed into gray. Here too, the paragraphs have been changed into gray. So let's assume now I also target the strong element. So I will say, so all the strongs, the color too should be blue. So in the midst of all these gray paragraphs, wherever we have strong, it should change into blue. And that's here it is. So right. So basically that's how we declare the tags. That's how we declare CSS rules. So we have a rule, and then the rule is composed of the selector and the declaration. So now this will bring us to this next topic, which is the selectors. How is the selection made? So this first type of bringing the tag name and then bringing some rules, bringing the tag name and bringing some rules and so on. This way of selecting is called type selection. So it's called type selection. Basically, we pick the tag type, any tag type, and we select it. So that's the first way of doing it. So pick any type of HTML tag, write the type name, and then put the declaration, and you are good to go. Everything will be applied to this particular type. This is very important, and it's one of the beauties of CSS, because you write one and then it applies to everything, and that's very fantastic thing. So the next way of selecting is grouping, right? Is grouping selectors. So now we've said, okay, we want to do this for heading 1. We could also say we not only want this to apply to heading 1, we also want it to apply to heading 2. We also want it to apply to heading 3, and so on, anything. Or it could also be applied to the UL at the same time, or to the LISO at the same time. So you see, we separate them with comma. That's what we call grouping. So if I now reload, you can see that this same thing applies to all the elements I mentioned inside this list. So this is the other way of selecting HTML elements with CSS. So grouping. So we have grouping. Then the next way of using selecting CSS elements is what we call the universal selector. So the universal selector is a selector that has just asterisk in front of it. Instead of using an HTML element, we use asterisk, and we'll be like, we select everything. So for this selector, let me try to use font size 12 pixels. So good. So by applying a star to this universal selector, it actually applies this star to anything on the page. It applies to all the HTML elements in our HTML documents. So anything can happen. So this is the second thing we are learning with CSS, the second instruction, or the second declaration. So we've learned the declaration color, and we now learned the declaration font size. So basically that's one way of selecting. So let's go back. We mentioned universal selector, universal selector. So using asterisk. Now we also have what we call the class and ID selectors. So let me improve the font size here by making it 18 pixels. So we have what we call the class and then ID selectors. Remember I said earlier on, so also I will change the star here. I'll remove the list, because the lists are different things and the headings are different things. So we keep the headings as such. And by the way, for the headings, we keep them to have the color of tomato. Good. Good. So we have something called classes and IDs. So if you do remember very well, I said that we could group some of the elements by using in a class. So let's assume all our LIs here, we can put them in a group, and we call this grouping classes. So we can say timeline. They are all part of the timeline of this lesson. So we can now group them into what we call timeline or timeline elements. So by saying timeline element or item, whatever we want, but that's the name of the class. They all belong to a class. And the particularity, I said, the difference between a class and an ID is an ID is always going to one tag. It cannot be assigned. The same ID cannot be assigned to different tags. But a class, many tags can belong to the same class. So whatever we do to that class goes to every element in that class. So if we have classes like this, we can also target elements through that class. So we write the name of the class. So by the way, let me just remove this thing to avoid you thinking about minus. So we name the class timeline. Then we bring the class name, and then we bring the curly bracket, and we also change, let's say, the color. And this time we make the color, let's say, long green, like this, and refresh, and nothing really happened. You might think, wow, what happened? Nothing. So there's something we need to do here and distinguish, especially when we are styling HTML. This looks like the way we were selecting the HTML tags or the type selection. Meanwhile, this timeline is not a tag, so the browser will be like, there's no tag of such. So if we were to start XML, then it's possible that we can invent our tags, and it's possible this will work. But in the case of HTML, we need to specify that this is not a tag, but it is rather a class. And the way of doing that is by prefixing it with a dot. So by prefixing it with a dot, we are telling the browser that, oh, this is not a tag, but rather a group of tags named or given a class or belonging to a class called timeline. So by doing that, now if we refresh, we should see that it has been applied. The effect has been applied to the document, specifically the group or the list or the class. So this is the thing. I think we should change this into simply green. Good. So here we are. So the other way is to use the ID selectors. So we said we could give an element with an ID. So let's assume we have this paragraph here. We want to distinguish this paragraph very well, and we want to target it uniquely, and we'll give it an ID. Will be like our intro, or let's say punchline. This is our punchline. So I'll make it punchline. So this is our punchline. We name it punchline because we need to hit. So we bring the CSS here. We'll be like, okay, we want to target the punchline, and what we are going to do is we want to increase the font size to 22 pixels. That's the first thing we want to do, and we'll go ahead and refresh. Oh, that one too, nothing really happened. So we also can see the same problem here, which looks like, oh, this is a tag, but it is not a tag. So to tell a browser that this is not a tag, we said in the class cases, we use the dot notation prefix. But here, if we do dot, this will look like it's a class. And if I do, there's no tag that has the class of punchline. So what do we do? In the case of ID, we use the pound sign or the hash sign to tell that this is an ID, not a class, not a tag. So if we refresh, you can see that particular line has its font size increased. So that's the effect. So the next thing I want you, or last thing I want you to see in this lesson is how we can combine declarations. So far in all our rules here, we can see that every declaration, we have only one declaration inside one. There's a way of combining them, and you can see me using semicolon sometimes too. So the reason is because we can actually use more than one declaration for the CSS rule. So in the case of our punch line, not only we want to increase the font size to 22 pixels, but we also want to change the color into, let's say, light green, or any color fine. This looks like many of our colors already. Good. Good. So we have it here, and I also want it to look bold. So we use what we call font weight, and we make it bold. So you can see, let me even use a purple, so it is obvious. Good. So we can see, so we've had the first declaration, the second declaration, the third declaration, and all the declarations should be separated with a semicolon. That's the thing with multiple declarations in one CSS group. So you have that, and all you have to do next is just to learn most of these declarations. So we have a declaration for the color, a declaration for the font width, a declaration for the font size, and so on, borders, font families, and so on. So that's what we'll be learning over time, and how to play with these tricks, the display of the HTML elements, how do we switch from this display to the other display, and so on, using CSS. So that will be our job, and in our next lesson we are going to go deep in how to affect the display of our elements on an HTML document. By the way, as a bonus, for those who were wanting to actually reduce the size of their document, like have it shrink, so they could use CSS and target, let's say, the body tag, and set the width to, let's say, 50%, and you can see now your content has been reduced to a short size. So there are better ways of doing this, but this is a cheat for you for today. Thank you so much for staying around. Subscribe to our channel, share this video with other people, let them also come and learn. Don't keep this knowledge to yourself alone. So see you in day 9.